In the quiet suburbs of Greenwood Heights, Laura and Daniel lived an idyllic life. Their neighbors admired them for their impeccable manners, their beautiful home, and their apparent dedication to community activities. No one suspected the darkness behind their polished facade, the carefully concealed secrets that defined their twisted existence. For years, Laura and Daniel had operated as a meticulous duo of child abductors. They preyed on vulnerable targets, carefully selecting children who seemed easy to snatch away without raising suspicion. Each abduction was carefully planned, executed with chilling precision, and followed by a meticulous cover-up operation to evade detection. On a particularly stormy night, their target was Emily, a 10-year-old girl with a penchant for drawing and a love for her pet cat. The rain pounded against the windows as Laura and Daniel crept through the shadows, their hearts racing with anticipation. They moved swiftly, silently, expertly bypassing the creaky floorboards of Emily's bedroom. With a precision born of practice, they snatched Emily from her bed, muffling her cries before they could alert her sleeping parents. In mere minutes, they were out of the house and driving away into the night, leaving only a child's empty room and bewildered parents who would soon be plunged into the depths of anguish. In the days that followed, the disappearance of Emily sent shockwaves through the Greenwood Heights area. The community rallied together, organizing search parties, distributing flyers, and pleading for any information that could lead to her safe return. Laura and Daniel, acting the part of concerned neighbors, joined in the search efforts, their expressions carefully schooled into masks of worry and grief. But unlike their previous abductions, Emily's disappearance did not trigger the expected alarm. No Amber Alert was flashing on TV screens. No breaking news updates on the local channels. It was as if Emily had vanished into thin air without a trace, and the eerie silence that followed unnerved Laura and Daniel more than they cared to admit. As the days stretched into weeks with no progress in the search for Emily, Laura and Daniel grew emboldened. They began to plan their next abduction, confident in their ability to continue their reign of terror without consequence. Their next target was Sara, a 9-year-old girl who lived on the outskirts of town, far from prying eyes and concerned neighbors. On a moonless night, Laura and Daniel struck again. They lured Sara into their car under the guise of offering her a ride home from the park, her innocent trust unknowingly sealing their fate. As they drove deeper into the darkness, Sara's laughter filled the car, oblivious to the malevolent intent lurking behind the facade of smiles. Arriving at their scheduled hideout, an old cabin nestled deep in the woods, Laura and Daniel believed they were in control. Their previous successes reinforced their false sense of invulnerability. They ushered Sara inside, confident in their ability to keep her subdued and compliant. But Sara was different. Unbeknownst to Laura and Daniel, Sara was not an ordinary child. She was a vessel for a malevolent entity that had, since their darkness, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. As the hours passed and midnight approached, the atmosphere inside the cabin grew charged with unsettling energy. Shadows seemed to dance in the corners, and the air hummed with an otherworldly presence. Sara's behavior shifted subtly at first, her gaze unnervingly steady, her words carrying an uncanny wisdom far beyond her years. Laura and Daniel brushed off these signs of unease, dismissing them as their paranoia and fatigue from the latest crime. But then, The inexplicable began to unfold. Objects moved on their own, sliding across tables and crashing to the floor. Whispers echoed through the empty rooms, words that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Sara's laughter took on a chilling edge, her eyes darkening with a malevolent gleam that sent shivers down Laura and Daniel's spine. As the night wore on, the entity within Sara began to assert its dominance. Sara's body contorted unnaturally, her voice shifting to a guttural growl that spoke ancient languages unknown to human ears. Laura and Daniel watched in growing horror as the child they had abducted became a conduit for something far beyond their comprehension, a force that thrived on fear and suffering. Their attempts to restrain Sara were futile. Ropes slipped through their fingers as if guided by an invisible hand, and locks on doors clicked open of their own accord. Panic set in as Laura and Daniel realized they were no longer the hunters. They had become the hunted, trapped in a nightmarish game where the rules were dictated by forces they could not control. In a desperate bid for survival, Laura and Daniel tried to flee the cabin, their footsteps echoing loudly in the oppressive silence of the night. But each path they chose seemed to lead them deeper into the heart of darkness, further away from the safety of the outside world and closer to the entity's domain. Sara, now fully under the entity's control, pursued them relentlessly. She moved with an unnatural grace, appearing and disappearing like a phantom in the shadows. Her laughter rang out like a macabre symphony, haunting Laura and Daniel's every step as they stumbled through the labyrinthine corridors of their own making. Exhausted, on the brink of madness, Laura and Daniel found themselves cornered in the cabin's dimly lit basement. The air was heavy with the stench of fear and the palpable presence of the entity, its dark energy coalescing around them like a suffocating shroud. With nowhere left to run, and their backs against the cold stone wall, Laura and Daniel faced the ultimate reckoning. They were forced to confront the horrifying truth of what they had become: monsters in human form, responsible for unspeakable atrocities that had torn families apart and left scars that would never heal. As Sara stood before them, her eyes blazing with the fury of the entity within, Laura and Daniel begged for mercy. They pleaded for their lives, their voices trembling with terror and regret. But there was no mercy to be found in the entity's wrath, no forgiveness for those who had willingly embraced the darkness in their pursuit of power and control. In a final act of defiance, Sara raised her hands, and the cabin trembled as if caught in the throes of an earthquake. Shadows twisted and writhed, merged with Sara's form until she appeared as a spectral figure bathed in ethereal light. With a single gesture, she unleashed a torrent of supernatural force that consumed Laura and Daniel, their screams drowned out by the deafening roar of the entity's triumph. A storm raged on the outside, oblivious to the horrors that had unfolded within the cabin walls. The night sky remained indifferent to the fate of Laura and Daniel, their names destined to be whispered in hushed tones as a cautionary tale of the darkness that lurks within the human soul. As dawn broke over Greenwood Heights, the cabin stood silent and still, its secrets buried beneath layers of moss and ivy. The community continued with their lives, unaware of the evil that had once hidden in plain sight amongst them, the evil that had been unleashed and ultimately consumed its creators. (4/20, 2024). Hey, I'm Tatum Norlander. I'm an avid hiker, kayaker, climber, and overall outdoor enthusiast. I've been hiking consistently for 3 years now. I've been all throughout Idaho and northwestern United States, and with this, I've had some strange encounters and incidents over the years I thought you might be interested in. Some of these I personally experienced, whereas many others are hearsay or things I was told by other hikers or hiking groups. I can't back up the stories beyond my own. Belief is entirely your choice in this endeavor, and all I can do is hope that you choose to believe. But if you don't, well, I hope you enjoy some intriguing and terrifying tales nonetheless. My friend Jesse Ryder is a night owl. He's been a night owl for as long as I can remember, and although I never disapproved of it, it does make doing things with him rather annoying. He prefers to go hiking at night, and so despite being longtime friends, we don't spend that much time together. Regardless, this odd and rather unsafe habit has led to some weird stories. As of last year, we shared an apartment, and every morning he'd arrive home for breakfast only to tell me about his adventures from the night before. This was not one of these times, and in fact, this story, which he told me 2 weeks ago, was what initially inspired me to make this blog. Last night, I met up with him and recorded him telling me this story. Here's a transcript of that recording. Okay, recorder's on, so I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Alright, well, I guess I should start at the start. Most nights I was out driving. I've always loved just driving out in the woods. It's always been really comforting to me. Something about having the quiet, dark woods all to myself, but unlike most nights, I wasn't alone. I was with Brandon. I talked him into driving down the bridge with me. Can you talk about the bridge? Yeah, I can. So, the bridge is an old trestle bridge that goes over Snake River. Till a couple of years ago, it was still in operation, but for whatever reason, they condemned it. I presume you don't know why then? Yeah, nobody has a clue. Bridge is still as sturdy and stable as ever, which is why me and Brandon went down there. It's a fun place where you can hang out and be loud while knowing we won't be bothered. Okay, tell me more about the night of your encounter. So me and Brandon parked the truck on the nearby logging road and made the short hike through the dark woods towards the bridge. Sometimes it can get pretty nerve-wracking walking on that bridge. It's not very wide, and worse still, it doesn't have any handrails to speak of. You gotta walk along it and hope you don't lose your balance. But I think I kinda like that about it. There's this thrill to it, like I know I'm doing something that most people wouldn't do. Where was I? Oh, right, the bridge. That night, me and Brandon brought a 6-pack of beer. In hindsight, a pretty dumb move, and a shotgun. We had this game we would do. When one of us would finish a beer, we'd grab the shotgun and toss the empty can off the bridge. The goal was always to shoot the can before it fell out of range. Well, that night, Brandon finished his beer first, so reluctantly, I handed him the shotgun and got ready to throw his can. I'd like to emphasize something here really quick. Up to this point, the night was normal. We could hear the owls in the trees and the chirping of the crickets and the rushing of the river, but that quickly changed. Hey, can we get a break for a minute? Yeah, I threw the can up in an arc. Brandon aimed just below where it was. Time seemed to slow down as I watched the can fly through the air. The moonlight reflected so brightly off of it, I had to look away for a minute. Bang! Can exploded and rocketed off down towards the ground. For a moment we were both grinning and laughing, happy the first shot had made it. Then a new sound filled my still ringing ears. There's nothing like it. Never heard anything like that horrible caw sound. I don't even know how to describe it. Give it a try, man. For 2 long weeks, I've been researching all sorts of animal calls, but wasn't any of them. There were familiar sounding calls, but not one like this one. I'll try my best to explain the sound, whatever you want to call it. Call kind of had a flow of laughter, but you could tell it wasn't laughing like a hyena, you know? The call was comprised of multiple cacophonies of laughter with deep grumbling sounds in between them. The laugh and high notes of the call were so long. For my research, most calls don't last longer than about 10 seconds, but this one had to have lasted a few minutes. Each high note was almost the duration of a normal animal call. I've researched a lot of animal calls. Oddly, the closest thing I've found is a kookaburra, howler monkey, certain great apes, and tigers. I don't mean to say the call sounded like all of them at once, but more different elements of the call sounded like each animal. The kookaburra has a similar pitch and sounds of high notes. The howler monkeys have similar durations of sound. The great apes and the tiger have a similar growl at the low note. Now, I know how long I just took to describe that, but that call only lasted a minute, and the whole time me and Brandon just stood there, too horrified to move. As soon as that call ended, we just started running. The call had come from off to the side of the bridge that we had to go to, although from the way it echoed, you could tell it was a lot closer to the river. Me and Brandon were going as fast as we could while still trying to be careful. Brandon, who arguably was more terrified than me, had loaded the shotgun just in case. As we made our way closer to the edge of the bridge, started to hear things. The rustling of leaves, the snapping of branches. I knew then that whatever was down there was making its way to us. I said screw it, and safety went right out the window. I started sprinting the rest of the bridge. Brandon stayed at my heels, breathing heavy and shaking like a leaf. Once we made our way to the solid ground, we just started flying down the trail. We were both terrified something was chasing us, and in the distance, I could hear something large moving through the forest. As we ran, it seemed to gain on us. I kept turning around, but every time I was greeted by nothing but dark forest. We can take a break if you need to. Yeah, I might need a minute. After a few minutes, Jesse said he could continue. I tripped. The last time I went to turn around, I lost my footing and I tripped. I face planted onto the ground, scraping my arms and face pretty bad. Before I could even pull myself up, Brandon was practically dragging me by the collar of my shirt. That damn whatever it was getting even closer. We sprinted onward for our lives. I was holding the truck keys in front of me, slamming the hazard button, just hoping that it might save us. It was just when I was starting to think that this thing might catch us that the wonderful sound of the truck horn burst through the quiet night. The sounds of the thing stopped, but we kept running. We didn't stop until the truck doors were locked behind us. We sat there in the truck, wheezing and trying to get the air in our lungs that we'd lost. At last, I flicked on the truck lights, and the rugged forest road ahead of us was illuminated. But I noticed something else. It must have been at least 20 feet in the trees. There were 2 eyes casting red from the headlights. I hadn't been back to the forest since. Jesse's story is not the only one I have. Far from it. In the spirit of good nature, I will share 3 more that I think you'll all find quite interesting. Hopefully, if you do, I'll follow up with another post with more stories. The next story, or rather topic, I would like to address is, well, bunkers. Since I was little, I've heard stories of these supposedly deep in the woods, or massive underground bunkers. Nobody knows why they're there, or what their purpose is. In fact, most people have never actually seen one, but stories have been around long enough that I thought I would bring them up. To be perfectly honest, I'm bringing these up to see if any of you have heard of one, or maybe even seen one. Closest thing I have to one is a strange story that an acquaintance told me. He told me a story that his grandfather had told him, and that this had happened to his grandfather in the early 50s. His granddad, a man named John, had served in World War II, and after the war had become sort of a hermit. He'd been traumatized by the war to such a degree that when he came home, he became a hermit. So much so that he moved to the mountains to live in the woods by himself, away from the people that reminded him of his mental burden. It was after 5 years of that he found it. John was patrolling through the woods looking for some mushrooms to add to his stew. He'd just crested a large hill and was descending the slope of the hill and into a gully. Within the gully was a decent-sized flowing stream. Curious, as the gully was new to him, John quickly descended the hill and into the gully. As he walked through the gully, he noticed something up ahead. There was something built on a large rocky outcrop near the wall. It must have been 15 feet above where he stood, so he could only vaguely make out something on top of it. He called out when he saw a thin line of smoke ascending from the outcrop, but no one responded. He quickly ascended the outcrop to a strange and horrifying sight. A desk sat atop the outcropping. It was an ornate, well-crafted desk, comprised of wood. The wood was polished, with an exquisite detail carved into it. It looked like it would have been in an office room of some rich man. Next to the desk was an equally exquisite chair that lay on its side, and atop the desk sat a typewriter and a banker's lamp, a ballpoint pen, and a few scattered pieces of paper. What really horrified him, though, was the lamp. The lamp was on. He walked closer, only to see on the paper were normal banker's reports. He was so horrified by the sight, he hurried and left without another look, and he refused to ever go back. In fact, it was the last straw that pushed him back into society, where he later got married and had my acquaintance's father. Another story comes from a distant friend of mine named Aaron Briggs. He told me this by campfire when we were talking about experiences we'd had when we were kayaking. This was about the same time I'd started thinking about maybe making this blog, so, like my conversation with Jess, I recorded it and wrote a transcript for the post. So you know Tate. Something real weird happened last time I went out kayaking with him. What's that? Well, I saw something weird in the water. It was like a big something. Go on. Well, I was kayaking along the shore of Michigan, Lake Michigan, that is, with a couple of other guys. It was pretty normal. We were having a lot of fun, and Isaac kept picking up mud with his paddle and swinging it back at us like the moron that he is. Well, I'd just reached the section near the thick patch of reeds, and I was trying to steer away from it, not wanting to get caught up in them. That's when it happened, in a snap. The water near the edge of the reeds burst with a horrendous explosion of sound as something beneath it dived towards my kayak. I hardly had time to react, only able to turn my head to see how large the disturbance in the water was. Thing smashed into the side of my kayak, flipping it over and flipping me out. Next thing I knew, I was swimming up to the surface, watching a massive dark shape disappear into the foggy water. What the hell? That was what I thought. You think it was a jumping sturgeon? Maybe, but the thing looked too broad, and it would have to be a massive sturgeon. Catfish, maybe? From its silhouette in the water, it was broad in the middle and narrow on each end. Catfish aren't built like that. It's pretty weird, man. Pretty weird indeed. We both tried brainstorming a few more ideas on what it could have been, but we didn't reach a verdict, and honestly, if any of you know your fish and can tell us what that probably was, feel free to share. Last thing I want to talk about is, I wasn't sure if I should bring it up, but my friend said you guys would probably find it interesting. These, like most of the strange things, aren't very common, but more common than you might expect. All the time, when we're out in the woods, we'll stumble across dead animals. And I know that isn't really disturbing, but trust me, these are. I've seen a few weird ones, and they were pretty ghastly. One time in Glacier National Park, I found a mountain goat lying on the side of the road. Its neck was broken so severely the head was barely hanging on. That in itself was traumatic, but I almost puked when I saw the maggots and flies all inside of its mouth and eyes. An especially adventurous worm was slithering out of one nostril. Me and Marcus, the guy I was with, ended up moving it 100 or so feet into the woods. We didn't want anyone else to see it. Another one was actually a pair of corpses. They were 2 bull elks. I'd found them while out hunting, lying on a riverbank. Blood was everywhere, and they'd sustained horrible injuries in an attempt to separate from one another. Their corpses were bony husks, which led me to the sad realization that they'd probably starved to death. It was only after looking long enough that I came to the realization that one of the bulls was still alive, but it was knocking on death's door. Out of mercy, I aimed the barrel into its forehead and fired. It died instantly. That one was pretty rough, and from time to time, I still find myself thinking about it. The worst one I ever found, though, was a wolf. That one scared me for different reasons than the others. With the others, they were tragic incidents of nature, but this one, couldn't be explained. For context, me and Marcus and Aaron and another friend named Tanner took a high school graduation trip to Alaska. Our group was to go ice fishing, snowmobiling, and hunting. It was while snowmobiling through miles of snow-covered forest that we found it. The quickly setting Alaskan sun cast a red glow off the blood-drenched snow. The light made the steam coming from it glow like thick clouds of gas, so much so that it blinded us, and we had to stop. With a closer look, we could see the horribly mutilated wolf that the steam was coming from. Blood was all over the snow, with flecks of muscle tissue, bones, and long snaky cords of intestine. The cords led from the upper body of the wolf. In life, it must have been beautiful, large, and impressive, but now it was nothing more than a mutilated body. The upper body was broken and beaten. The ribs were caved in and shattered to splinters. The skull was split open, exposing the brain. The jaws looked like they'd been forced open to their limit before cracking under the pressure. The organs spilled out of every hole in its body. We all threw up. Marcus started sobbing, and Aaron looked on the verge of a panic attack. I had to step away, still puking, and had to lean against a tree. I was hurling, screaming, and crying. This was nothing like I'd ever seen, and it was horrible. It was only then that I felt it, a steady dripping of warm liquid on the top of my head. I stepped away from the tree before looking up into the branches. The lower half of the wolf dangled in one of those branches, so broken that if it weren't for the upper counterpoint, I would never have recognized it. We all hurried out of there, completely traumatized. I think I'll end this post here. If you have any interest in the subject, I will continue this blog with a second post. Please comment, question, or anything of that nature. I promise to read as many as I can. Also, if you have any similar stories, please feel free to share in the comments, or message me if you would like it to be a potential for the next post. Thanks for your time. Tatum, over and out. Someone was screaming. The sound pulled me from a dream, and I woke in the dark, short of breath and damp with sweat. It was my mother, I realized. Have you ever noticed how you can recognize the voice of one close to you, even through as little as a cough or a cry? There's no need for words. I heard and knew it was her. I sat up in bed, confused and frightened. The screams had stopped, but I could still hear talking downstairs. My parents. I slid out from beneath the covers and crept to my door, bare feet cold on the ancient wooden boards. A decade had passed, but I still remember the strongest details. The way those floorboards creaked, the dust that made me sneeze, the shadows of the night clouds slipping silently across the scene, nipping at my heels. All these things, as meaningless as they were, are burned into me, like scars when I close my eyes. Mom and Dad's voices were raised, upset. In our old home, they would have woken the neighbors by now. But not here, not in the middle of nowhere. There was no one within a mile. I held the door handle and eased it down so it made no sound, stepping into the hallway, leaving my door open behind me. Moonlight spilled out around my feet, a pale wash chasing shadows into the corners. Felt like I'd only been asleep for a few hours, but I couldn't be certain. I worked my way to the top of the stairs, a few inches at a time. I could make out occasional words from below, but nothing yet that made any sense. I'd stopped to listen when the door beside me creaked open, making me jump. My younger sister, Maria, was only 6, all wide eyes and worried face and tousled black hair that hung wild around her. I recall thinking it was odd that our brother Ryan hadn't left his room. Usually if our parents woke us up with their arguing, he would be up first, to get us back to sleep and tell us not to worry, to tell us not to listen. "Go to bed," I hissed at her. She frowned and retreated, but kept the door ajar. I tiptoed forward onto the top step, listening. My father, loud and demanding. "Tell you again. Now don't make me do it, Lisa." "Do what?" My mother's angry, tearful. "Crazy. Don't do this. Call the police. Phone an ambulance. Please, David, please." Her voice went on as I heard footsteps approaching the stairs. They were coming up. A surge of panic, and I turned, rushing back to my room. I caught my sister peering around her doorframe and mouthed, "Go!" to her as I passed. The footsteps behind me grew closer, my mother's voice clear. I climbed back into bed, heart racing, when I heard her feet in the hallway. They went into Ryan's room, which was opposite of Maria's, but not their own opposite mine. Why, I wondered. Where was my brother? Dad was speaking, voice thick and heavy. He told Mom to sit down, then again louder, and she snapped a reply I couldn't make out. "Did you break the rules I gave you?" he asked her. "Did any of you?" My mother replied inaudibly. "Did you break any of the rules I gave you?" His voice raised again. "Just answer me!" "No." Her voice broke as she shouted back. "No, please, David, for God's sake, phone an ambulance. It might not be too late. It might not. You don't know. You don't know it." "Did anyone come in the house?" He cut her off, tone low and threatening. "Did any of you leave?" "No, David, please." She was still speaking when I heard him step into the hall. Then the door closed and keys rattled. My mother's voice rose to a scream, and I could hear her running across the floor. "What are you doing?" Her hands were hammering on the door. "David, what are you doing? Don't hurt them, David. Don't you hurt our girls. David, please." Why would she say that, I thought. He would never hurt us. My father would never hurt me. What was going on? I heard the creak of floorboards beneath her cries, and then Dad opened my sister's door. He spoke quietly. I couldn't make it out. Maria's door closed and locked. Then he was walking again, towards my room. Mom was still shouting, sobbing, calling our names, words collapsing into each other until they were only sounds of frustration, pain, and rage. My door opened. I looked over the edge of the covers, pretending I was still asleep. I was so scared, I didn't know what else to do. My father stood in the doorway. He was holding a shotgun, and it was pointed at my chest. "Evie, sweetheart, we need to talk." We had only been in the house for a week. If everything had went to plan, we would have been gone before another month had passed. At the beginning of the year, Dad's elder brother had passed away. He was the only one living member on that side of the family, so my father inherited everything. Our parents were contacted by a law firm who had been engaged as executors of the will, and a meeting was organized to discuss the details. Now, our dad hadn't spoken to his brother in decades, or anyone on his side of the family for that matter. Ryan, Maria, and myself had never met any of them. Dad would never talk about them. Strangely, he seemed more worried than upset by the news of our uncle's death. When my parents attended the meeting, the true scope of the inheritance was revealed. The home, left to him, was more than a century old and had once housed 20 family members and staff. 3 floors, basement, attic, outhouse, and miles of property. At present, most of the place was filled with an accumulation of possessions of 5 generations of rich landowners. The contents alone could be worth a small fortune. The house and the grounds certainly were. My mom, shocked and delighted, couldn't wait to tell us. Dad, however, remained taciturn, simultaneously unsurprised and pained by his apparent good fortune. He didn't want to accept it, he said. Our mother couldn't believe him and demanded to know why. Because of the condition of the will, he told her. We would all have to move there and take possession of the house. No one except family could be allowed inside, not under any circumstances. But he didn't want to go back there, no matter what the offer was. He certainly wouldn't take his wife and children to that godforsaken place. Mom was furious. She thought it was crazy to turn it down. So what if he had to move there? His refusal to explain any further only made it worse. They argued on and off for weeks. There was a silence between them that went on for days until we were in bed. Then the arguments would begin again. Why wouldn't he accept the house? She would ask. Why wouldn't he explain? My father never answered, just repeated the same refusal and denials. Whatever happened there's over, I heard her say one night. You never spoke to them, never spoke about any of them. They're gone. I'm your wife. We're your family, here and now. I lay awake in bed, picking out bits and pieces as I tried to sleep. I never heard the final argument, but Ryan did. He told me and Maria about it on the walk to school. Mom said she had spoken to a lawyer of her own about the will. We could move there for just a short time, she said, maybe only a month. Then we claim we can't stay because it's hurting the kids' upbringing. It wouldn't even be a lie. There isn't a good school for 40 miles, police or ambulance for that matter. No other families are nearby. It's isolated. We say it's affecting all our mental health. There's no living relatives to contest with. My lawyer thinks that we could fight it out in court and win. Afterwards, we sell what we can and keep what we like. Do anything we want. We'll be rich, David. No more 5 people living in 2 bedrooms. We could do whatever we want. All we have to do is make it look like we tried. My father hadn't replied. Then Mom told him that she would leave with us if he didn't accept it. Divorce. To be refusing this opportunity, just throwing away all our futures, she said, over reasons that he couldn't even explain. If he could be that stupid and selfish, then he didn't deserve to be our father, and wasn't the man that she thought he had been. David had left after that, Ryan told us. Went out for hours during the night. The two of them didn't speak at all the next day. Then a week later, our parents sat us down and said they had news. We were going away together to clear out and sell the old house that we had inherited. It should only be a month or so, they said. Then we could come back home. I need you to tell me what you done today. Dad? I began to cry, unable to hold back the tears. What's going on? Why is... Answer me, Evie. I don't want to hear anything else. Tell me what happened today, and nothing else. You understand? When I drove back to the city this afternoon, did someone come to the house? Did any of you leave? Tell me true. He never came any closer than the doorway, keeping the gun on me the entire time. Nothing happened. I was too upset to think clearly, unable to take it all in. My mother told him we never left the house, didn't she? Why had she lied? Was Dad gonna hurt me if he found out? I glanced at the wall beside my room, and he noticed. You heard what we were saying, me and your mom. Of course you did. I didn't reply. I just wiped away the tears and tried to hold back any more. It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you, baby. The barrel lowered. I could see his eyes were red where he'd been crying. This was hurting him, I realized. Doing this was hurting him. I just need you to tell me the truth. This is very important, Evie. What did you do today? Did you go out? I was just a child, overwhelmed and confused. Every time in my life I'd been frightened, I would run to my dad. Every time I needed someone, I could call his name and he'd be there. Now he was the one I was scared of, and I was lost. I started to get out of bed to go to him, but he pulled back, the gun snapping up. No! He pointed the weapon right at me. Stay where you are. Don't move. Back on the bed. There was a pleading in his eyes and voice. Please, Evie, don't make me. I had never seen him angry and emotional like this. Never in my life. He'd never even shouted at me before. He just wasn't that type of man. Evie, tell me right now, did any of you leave the house today? Yes. I saw it hit him. This truth, like a physical blow, sapping the strength from his body. He took a faltered step back and leaned against the doorframe, face paling to ghost white, a sharp intake of breath through his clenched teeth. We went to the village. I kept talking, not knowing what else to do. I couldn't stop the words once they had started. All of us, we got separated at the shop, and Mom got angry. Maria, she ran off to see the horses. There were horses in one of the open fields. I went after her, but she wouldn't come back. Mom and Ryan had to help till we found her. I remember that afternoon, chasing my sister down stone side streets under the gray sky. We were just going for a walk. Mom had told us to get out of the house for an hour. She had said, handing us our coats, but remember, don't tell your dad. She laughed, and Ryan did too. Dad was being silly, we thought. The four of us took a winding path through the trees and across the fields of wet grass until we reached the village. A church, a shop, and a dozen homes. We found everything closed and silent. I didn't see a single other person, not even a face at a window or a passing car. Maybe no one lives here anymore, Ryan said. Mom didn't say anything. When Maria ran off, I followed, but I couldn't make her come back on her own. I went for my mom and brother. When I found Maria the second time, we all came home. Nothing happened. How long were you all separated? My father's words were cold now, flat and emotionless. How long were you on your own? I don't know. How long, Evie? 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. He wasn't looking at me anymore, just staring at the floor. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand and backed into the hall. Daddy, where's Ryan? He glanced up, our eyes meeting, and I'd never seen hurt on his face like I did then. But he didn't answer me, just swung the door closed and locked it. A minute or so passed, and I could hear him pacing the floor, steps interspersed with cries from my mother, which he ignored. Then his voice, just outside my room. Evie, I need you to stay here for a little while, baby. Stay away from this door. I'll be back soon, okay? There was a second pause, and then, I love you. I heard him go to my sister's room. He spoke to her briefly through the door, then he headed upstairs. My mom kept shouting, calling his name as the footsteps receded. I hadn't even moved since he left, just sat there on the bed, cracked and hollowed out. Evie? My mom's voice came from the next room. I went to the wall and knelt down, pressing my ear against it. Are you okay, sweetheart? I'm okay, Mom. Did I do something wrong? No, baby, no, of course not. I'm gonna get us out of here, okay? It's gonna be all right. He won't hurt you. I won't let him hurt you. Your dad, he just isn't feeling well. He isn't himself. We'll get help. It's gonna be okay. I promise. I could hear footsteps on the stairs again, and my mom moved away from the wall. The rattle of keys and the door of her room opened. I stayed where I was, still, and listening. Get back to the window, Lisa. My father's voice was colder than before, dead and hardened. I told you not to go out. Why'd you lie to me? You were pointing that gun at me. She didn't cry anymore. Her words were clear and angry. I was scared. I didn't know what you would do if I told you. I didn't know what to say. I'd seen our... Stop. Tell me what happened today. We went out, like Evie told you. We went for a walk, David. A grown woman and her children went out for a walk. We're not prisoners, are we? We're not... I asked you not to. I've never asked anything of you since we've been together. His voice strained, cracking as he spoke. I've never asked you to do anything for me, change anything for me, not ever. It was just this once I needed you to trust me. One time, follow the rules I gave you. Why, David, why? You order your family to follow these stupid rules, but you won't explain why. We thought you were losing your mind. All of us did. You've been so strange since we got here. You won't tell me anything. I'm your wife. You act like I'm some idiot who can't be told the truth. Shut up. His reply was so loud and sudden that I pulled away from the wall. You don't have any idea. No idea what you've done. Then tell me. Her voice changed, pleading, understanding. Tell me what's going on. You can tell me, David. We can... Stop it. Stop changing the subject. What happened today in the village? Nothing, David. Nothing happened. We went to the local shop, but it was closed. Walking in the... You got split up. The four of you. Maria ran off. Was gone for 2 seconds, David. You know what she's like. She ran off and Evie went after her. When she couldn't catch her, we split up and found her. Something clattered on the floor. Put 'em on. There's a metal bar underneath the window. Around that. Are you serious? Do it, Lisa. I heard her moving, then the sound of a chain followed by a metallic snap. She started to speak again, but he was already leaving, locking the door behind him. He went to Maria, and a few minutes passed. Voices too quiet to understand. I thought I heard Maria crying, but I couldn't make out any words. I was too afraid to move closer to listen. Then more footsteps. Evie, can you hear me? Yes. My voice wavered, coming out as a broken whisper. I need you to stand away from the door. Back at the window, baby, okay? I'm gonna come in, but I need you to stand there. Do you understand? Uh-huh. Speak properly, Evie. Say you understand. This is important. I understand. Do it now, honey. I scrambled over to the glass on all fours and put my back against the ledge. For a second, I saw the keyhole go dark and realized he was looking through it. Then the door unlocked, and he came in, gun still raised and pointed at me. He had a pistol now as well. I caught a glimpse of it under his shirt, tucked into his belt. His other hand held a pair of handcuffs. He tossed them on the floor, and they skidded to my feet. "The metal bar behind you, Evie, under the window. Put the cuffs around that bar, then clip them on your wrist." I nodded, picking them up and trying to do as he asked. "You have to trust me, baby, okay? I've always protected you, haven't I? Always. I need you to trust me." The handcuffs clicked into place, and I tightened them as he instructed. Then he backed out again and was gone. Through the window, a full moon flashed beneath the clouds. My breath steamed the glass, and the metal of the cuffs were cold on my skin. All I could do was wait. That house was unusual in many ways, not simply its isolation or my father's fear. Some of these things were small details I didn't pick up at first or thought nothing of, but not all. With the exception of my parents' room, every door was thick, heavy, and locked with a key. The only difference in their door was having no key, just a iron latch on the inside. As for the windows, none could be opened from either side. Not on any floor. Those metal bars that he put the cuffs around could be found under every one of those windows. The basement was filled with dusty, battered books we weren't allowed to read, and moldy boxes we weren't allowed to look at. Then there was the attic. My brother had gotten a look inside before Dad sent him back downstairs. It was filled with weapons, Ryan had told me. Old rifles and pistols and crossbows, marked and faded with rust and wear. Every part of the house seemed to be wasting away, decaying like a carcass stripped of its bones. It felt like somewhere you hid from life, not somewhere you lived. There was a story there only my father knew, and it was a story he would never tell. When he returned, he went to my mother first. I shuffled as close to the wall as I could to listen. "I've checked every part of this house to be certain. No one else is in here. No one else could have gotten in. It's impossible. That's how this place was built. I know that as well as anyone. I survived here for 16 years. My mother's reply was quiet, barely audible. "You're sick, David. You need help. All of this, it's insane. What are you doing here to me, to your family, to our girls, our son, Ryan, our son, David? This is insane." "Whoever's done it is in this house, Lisa. You understand that, don't you? Do you get that?" He went on as if he hadn't heard her. "One of the four of us. Could be you see. Could be you who... Well, we'll find out when the sun comes up." "What are you talking about? Please, David, please. I couldn't have told you. You would have thought I was crazy. You'd have taken the kids. I tried to stay away from this place, but you wouldn't listen. Didn't leave me any choice, did you? I should have known better. I did know better, but I still made the wrong decision." I could hear the waver in his speech, the grief and the pain and desperation. "David, they aren't like people think," he snapped, suddenly cutting her off. They're patient. Easier to stop in some ways. Much, much harder in others. They need to catch you alone. We're safe when we're inside or together, you see. Should never be alone, especially not outside." He paused for a moment, and I pressed close to the wall. "The wounds don't even show. I know that. I remember that. So you can't tell. Sometimes they don't even know what they are, Lisa. Like two minds in one body, like a parasite inside, waiting for a chance." "David," his words were calm and focused. "Listen to me. I don't understand what you're saying. I can't understand. But we can help. Please, whatever it is, whatever's wrong, we can fix it. Put down the gun. Let's go and call for help. We can go home. We can... No, it's too late for that. It's much too late. If you'd done what I asked, just done what I asked, it wouldn't have to be this way. But you never listened to me. Never." I heard movement then, and the door locked again. He went to my sister's room, and a minute later, he came to see me. He was pale, soaked in sweat, bottom lip cracked and bleeding. Evie, I have to do this, honey, okay? To keep you safe, to keep us all safe. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. But we have to do this. They can hide away from the crosses and questions, but the light always hurts them, at least a little. So then we'll know. I think I must have slept eventually. The sound of my father pacing the halls, the occasional shouts of my mother, they all faded as the empty hours passed. I used my feet to pull down the cover and pull it around me as best I could. I thought about my brother. Was he hurt? Mom had wanted to call the police, call an ambulance. Why wouldn't Dad do that? What had happened? Ryan couldn't be dead. No, not my brother. He couldn't be. I watched the forest through the dark windows, its glass now touched with frost. Watched for so long, I didn't know if I was awake or in a dream. The wind sighed and moved, and the shadows followed. And those dark shapes between the trees could have been figures or branches, or nothing at all. Morning was close. As the hours passed, I thought I could hear scraping sounds from Mom's room, very faint, only growing louder when my father was downstairs to use the toilet. When he returned, she began shouting at him again, loud and suddenly. He ignored her for a minute, then, realizing she wasn't going to stop, strode to her room. I heard the lock turn and the creak of hinges. Then it began. Rapid footsteps, followed by a cry, something striking flesh and a person falling, or more than one. My mother cursed, and metal hit the floor. I had sat up, every muscle tensed. I could hear her breathing heavily, moving around the room, lifting and dragging a heavy something. In a second, she was at my door, unlocking it and pulling it open, saying my name. She had the shotgun under one arm, the keys in her hand. She took off my cuffs. Then we were moving together to my sister's room. As I waited for her to open the door, I looked into Ryan's room. My father was on the floor, blood flowing from an ugly wound on the side of his head. Beside him lay the metal bar from under the window frame. I could see the holes in the plaster where my mother had worked it out during the night. He groaned and grabbed my mother's arm to warn her. "Shit!" she cursed as she stepped past me. Then she pulled the door closed and locked it. A minute later, we had my sister and were heading downstairs. As we reached the steps, I heard my father calling our names and slamming against the door. We didn't stop, taking the stairs as fast as we could, clinging to each other. As we reached the ground floor, my mother gave a hard intake of breath and pulled us both towards her, turning our faces away from whatever was there. Another slam came from above us, my father's cries echoing down the stairwell. "Close your eyes for me, both of you. Hold on to me and we'll go together. Keep them closed. Don't open them till we get out, okay? Don't look." We stumbled down those final steps as she held us, guiding us forward. A crash from above made me flinch, but we kept moving. "Go on, almost there." We were in the lounge when I looked again. I saw the hallway to the front door, broke into a run, letting go of my mother's arm. Almost there, I thought. I didn't realize how quiet it had gotten until I stopped. The sounds of movement, my mother's voice, the shouts from above, it was all gone. I turned and found myself alone. "Mom? Maria?" I started to walk back. I couldn't imagine going without them. "Mom!" I called. Then I saw them, laying together on the ground, Mom pale and motionless on her back. Maria was crouched over her, her face buried against her neck. My sister looked at me and smiled, teeth and lips black with blood. There was a ragged wound on my mom's throat. A gunshot rang out, a sudden thunder in the cold silence. Maria's body spun and fell across my mom, a thin trail of blood raining down across the dusty floor. I cried out, but I was frozen in place, too shaken and frightened to move. I could see my father swaying, blood in his hair and on his clothes, pistol in his hand, still aimed at my sister's body. Then she started to get up. Her tiny frame rose in jerks, unnatural movements, more like a broken puppet than the girl I'd known. She made it to her feet and turned towards him, her head hanging bloody and limp, still smiling though. "Daddy." He fired again, and the bullet struck her in the chest, knocking her back to the ground. I scrambled away into a corner, eyes closed and ears covered. Another shot. Then another. For a few minutes, there was nothing but the dark and my heart beating, flashing images that I couldn't push away. When I opened my eyes and took my hands away from my ears, it was over. My father walked towards the still body of his wife and youngest child. His feet dragged, arms hanging limp at his side. The gun fell from his hands and clattered across the wooden floor. He seemed to collapse as he went, falling down to them, making only wordless sounds of loss. I watched him there in the weak light, shaking and weeping over them, over the ruins of his life, broken and emptied of everything but grief. A pain for which no words would suffice. I don't remember getting up, walking to him. I touched his arm, and he saw me at last and pulled me close. The stench of sweat and blood and horror ran across us both, a wound that could never heal, only fester and burn. Outside, the sun was rising. I loved my father, even there at the end. He tried so hard to protect us, to keep us safe. But when humans are afraid, they miss the simplest things. They make mistakes, like thinking my sister was the only one. There's nothing to do in my town. If the internet had never been invented, I would have gotten stuck hanging out at the local coffee shop, desperate to fill my time. I have access to unlimited entertainment and information at my fingertips, and yet I still can't find answers about what happened last summer. I'm more of an indoor person. Somehow, my friend Kenny dragged me along on a camping trip with his brother and his childhood friend. We all grew up together. Kenny's brother was 2 years older, so it felt like we never really connected. I didn't dislike him, we just never had anything in common. My best friend was the prettiest girl in the county, and I think she knew it. I had been in love with her since I was 13, but I'd never admitted it to her. I know the moment I did, our relationship would change. I was scared she might reject my feelings or accept them. Just being friends suited me just fine. The only way to get me outside was if Mia was going to be there. I think Kenny and Darren knew that. If I refused to go on the camping trip, they asked Mia to come along, and they told me she would be with us. I hated how easily they played me. It was a hot day. All of us were sweating by the time we arrived at the campsite. "Can we set up the tent after?" Kenny said, as he let the bags drop from his shoulders. "No, let's get it done now, or else we won't get it done in time," I told him, no matter how much I wanted to put it off. I knew him. The last trip he and his brother took, they were too lazy to set up the tent and just slept outside in their sleeping bags. They came back home covered in bug bites. I didn't want a repeat of that. They both groaned, but they listened to me. Mia and I worked on one tent while the brothers set up the other. "There are only 2 tents, I pointed out. "We've shared tents before," she replied, not looking up. If she had, she would have seen how red my face had got. At least, I could blame the sunny weather for my flushed cheeks. Kenny decided to toss a full water bottle at Darren, but missed. It hit me upside the back of the head, and I needed to go over then and roughhouse for a little bit. Mia crossed her arms, amused by us. I got my butt handed to me, like always. As I got back up off the ground from the play fight, I noticed something white flash between the trees. I was about to mention it, but the color was gone as fast as I noticed it. We had picked a campsite that wasn't that popular with the locals, but that didn't mean there wasn't anyone else in the woods. We finally got the campsite set up, tents ready, food put away in case any animals, and the firewood gathered. Once that was all set, we started to head down the path that led to the lake. We all had earned a long swim. Kenny and Darren walked ahead of us, and I helped Mia down the rough pathway. "Should we really be camping right now?" Mia asked, loud enough for Kenny to hear. "Wasn't there a big search recently?" I'd heard a little about that. Kenny chimed in to explain what had happened. 4 campers high on shrooms walked into the woods and no one found any trace of them. That was 3 weeks ago, so I don't think we'll come across any feral lost campers," he said with a shrug. It was a bit heartless to imply those 4 were dead, but he was right. Those 4 didn't have a good chance of being around after dealing with that summer's heat for 3 weeks. "Just in case, let's not go out in the woods alone," I told him, suddenly feeling a chill, even though I was sweating. "Is that your fetish? You like to watch us pee?" Kenny teased. "I think it's number 2s. No free shows," Darren added. "Kinda weird how fast you guys thought of that. Almost like it was on your mind," I replied. "I've dealt with these guys for years. I expected the dumbest thing to come out of their mouths. Mia giggled at us, and I wondered why she put up with these morons." The lake wasn't as cold as I had hoped. The water was nice, and it did help with the heat, but I almost wished I was at home with the AC on full blast. When I saw Mia in her black one-piece swimsuit and trunks, the thought of AC went out of my mind. I kept forcing my eyes away from her, so she didn't know how much of a creep I was. I really needed to get a grip on myself, though. "Hey, do you see that?" I asked Kenny when he swam over to me. He wrapped an arm around my neck and playfully drugged me under, but stopped when I spoke up. He followed my line of sight into the woods, trying to spot what I was staring at. "Is that a person?" he asked, squinting. Soon, Darren and Mia were looking in the same direction. A white shape was between 2 trees on the other side of the lake. It didn't look like a person, but it was impossible to tell at that distance. It was too still to be a person, yet it didn't sway in the breeze as if it was a discarded shirt or some trash. "Let's go see," Kenny said, as he let go of my neck. He started to swim away, and Mia came up next to me. "What do you think it is?" she asked. When I'd taken my eyes off the tree and to her, the white object moved. Kenny stopped swimming when he realized what he'd been looking at was gone. "Probably some old pervert watching a tasty little thing swim around shirtless," Kenny said with a splash. "He's implying the old pervert is watching you," Derek finished with a smile. I slapped water in his face. Soon the white shape had been forgotten as we got into a water fight. I kept glancing back into the trees. The white shape didn't return, and I assumed it had been nothing after all. We started heading back to the campsite when the sky started to turn orange. Kenny and Darren chatted the entire way back about the beans they were going to cook and eat. I was glad I was not sharing a tent with them tonight. When we did get back, they discovered that somehow they left the bag that held the coveted beans back in the truck. Mia had also forgot a few things, so she went back with them. I didn't feel like walking, so I volunteered to stay behind and get the fire started. They'd been gone about 5 minutes when I heard Kenny's voice again off in the distance. Oddly enough, it wasn't in the direction they left in. "You forget something?" I called out. His voice came again, but I couldn't make out the words. It was coming from the direction of the lake, but he would have needed to walk through the campsite to be on that path. I stood up, straining to listen, calling out his name as I took a few steps closer to the path heading to the lake. "Kenny, stop fooling around," I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. Did he take the long way around just to scare me? No, he hadn't been gone that long for him to be that far out. I took another step closer, but stopped. This felt wrong. After those 4 people got lost in the woods, I decided I didn't want to go down a path alone. I went back to setting up the fire and getting dinner ready. If Kenny was playing a prank, then he would get bored and come back. Oddly enough, my 3 friends came back together. "Did you see any other cars around?" I asked, wondering if they had just been another camper out there that sounded like Kenny. "No, it's just us. Why?" Mia asked, catching on that something was bothering me. "I heard something while you guys were out. It sounded like a human, but it's hard to say." Now I was doubting myself, but that really sounded like a voice. Or was it just too far away to tell? "Probably a bird. Some of those loons or whatever they're called sound spooky," Darren said with a shrug. He went out camping here pretty often. I accepted that he knew what he was talking about and dismissed my concern. We settled down to eat. The brothers gladly ate cans of beans as Mia and I stuck to our hot dogs. The brothers also lit up an after-dinner treat. I didn't smoke, but Mia did on occasions. She passed that night. I Think she didn't want to bring the smell into the shared tent. Kenny stood up to say he needed to use the washroom. It had gotten dark, so I found him a flashlight. I also needed to go. Then Darren stood up, deciding that he should go with us. And Mia didn't want to be left alone, so we all gathered for a bathroom break. It was a bit hard to focus on the task at hand, knowing Mia was so close by. I knew she had her back turned to the three of us as we took care of business, yet it still took me the longest to finish. We scouted a good spot for her and gave Mia some privacy, but also kept scanning the trees in case a wild animal decided to suddenly appear. With all that taken care of, we were going to head back when an unnatural sound came from nearby. Something I never expected to ever hear while in the forest at night. A few feet away from us came the sound of a baby crying. I saw Kenny's pale face in the light of my flashlight. Darren silently shook his head as Mia stood frozen in place. I took a step closer to the source of the noise, and Darren's hand fell on my shoulder. "To hell with that," he whispered. I agreed and took a step back. We should all just leave. Mia, bless her, didn't want to risk someone actually being in trouble. She bravely marched off into the woods with 3 guys going after her, whispering for us to get out of there. We followed the source of the sound. She stopped just outside a small clearing with someone sitting on a log. They were dressed in rags with their back facing us. The figure hunched over, rocking back and forth as they made shushing sounds. We didn't hear the baby crying anymore. This was freaky, downright nightmare fuel. "Are you okay?" Mia asked in a shaky voice. "My baby, my poor baby," the woman spoke, and she sounded so normal compared to how she looked. "We can call someone to get you some help," Mia offered. "My poor baby is starving." Slowly, the figure turned its head. The light caught a set of gray eyes that reflected in the flashlight. Stringy gray hair fell over her pale face. At first, the expression was blank. Then the face transformed into something distorted and monstrous. Kenny and Darren were screaming before the creature stood up. They bolted, leaving Mia and me behind. I grabbed her wrist, forcing her to run as the pale creature screeched. It got on all fours to easily cross the clearing to reach us. It jumped into the air, mouth open and bony, clawed hands outstretched. I pulled Mia out of the way just in time. The creature crashed into a tree, then flipped around on the ground like a cat trying to right itself. We started running again. Mia's legs shook so much I ended up grabbing her around the waist to just drag her along behind me. To my horror, the monster kept coming for us. I needed to fight back. I let go of her long enough to find a hefty stick to use as a weapon. That was a mistake, although I'm not sure if we had any chance of getting away unscathed. The pale creature came down on Mia, biting down on her hand. She screamed and kicked to get the thing away from her. I slammed the branch as hard as I could on the monster's face. It screeched and released my best friend. I kept hitting it, but I think I was just pissing it off. Just as it was about to go into a counterattack, a whistle came from somewhere. For some reason, the creature suddenly got on all fours, a look of distress on its face. It turned tail and darted back into the woods. To my horror, I saw another pale figure between the trees, also take off running on all fours. I didn't care about the reason why they were leaving, only that we were safe for now. "How bad is it?" I said to Mia, turning all my attention on her. She shook her head with tears in her eyes. The bite wasn't as deep as I had thought. We had a first aid kit at camp. I took hold of her again and got us moving. I didn't hear Kenny or Darren. Even though they left us behind, I hoped they were safe. "It'll be all right. We'll get out of here. Do you have your phone?" I asked as we kept moving. She shook her head. I hadn't grabbed mine either. Sure, we were smart enough to go in a group, but we hadn't done anything intelligent after that. An odd whistling sound came through the trees. The strange melody chilled me to the core. Mia started to tug at my arm as we walked away from the whistling. I glanced over her shoulder and saw flashes of white darting around the branches above us. As much as I hated the whistling, going in that direction seemed like the better option. Mia protested a little when I pulled on her arm to get moving. I didn't want to scare her by telling her that the creatures were stalking us in the trees. When I heard Kenny scream, I forgot about the threat we faced and ran in his direction. Hearing his voice was a good sign. I just hope we got to him in time. We stumbled into another clearing. I raised the flashlight I somehow still had. The beam of light landed on a stranger's face. His left eye reflected the light, but his right eye didn't. His head was slightly tilted, as if amused by my sudden appearance. My skin crawled, seeing such a pleased face after a terrifying encounter beforehand. Kenny was on the ground, breathing heavily, with the man's foot on his chest. He also had a bite taken out of his arm that was freely bleeding. For a moment, it appeared he had a crossbow bolt sticking out of his chest. I soon realized the bolt was stuck inside a pale monster beside him. I didn't see it first. The stranger had a hunter's bow attached to his arm, loaded and ready to shoot. "What did you do to Kenny, and where's Darren?" I demanded with a trembling voice. The man licked his lips and lifted his foot off of Kenny's chest. He brushed the strands of dirty brown hair from his face, only to have it fall back down. "I just saved this one from being a midnight snack, and I sent the other one down the trail. He might not reach the end alone, though," the stranger said, ending his sentence with a raspy laugh. He sounded as if he smoked a pack a day for most of his life. I didn't trust the guy. Mia tightened her grip on my arm, showing she felt the same way. "Two of you got bitten tonight. Bites can turn people into those things. The infected ones won't be able to stand the whistling." After the man spoke, he started whistling in a way that didn't sound human. It was as if a songbird was trying to imitate a man-made instrument. I hadn't been bitten that night, yet the noise put me on edge. Kenny recovered enough to scramble away from the stranger. Mia didn't react, aside from appearing as nervous as she did when she first stumbled onto the scene. Finally, the man finished whistling and then studied us all very carefully. He raised the crossbow and rested it against his shoulder. "The trail is just past those two trees. You kids better get going." A weight had been lifted off my chest. Aside from some minor injuries and a few scars, we were free to leave. Kenny was the first to get up. His legs shook as he tried to walk towards where we had been directed. Mia and I walked past the man, feeling his eyes on us. All the stress from the night came back as he gave us his unseen, judging stare. I thought we were in the clear when a sharp whistle came again. It was sudden, and I jumped. Mia did as well. I turned around to comfort her, and what I saw caused my entire world to come crumbling down. Her face changed. The person I'd cared for so deeply and for so long looked nothing like her. In her shock, she dropped her mask to let a contorted version of herself show through. When she realized her cover had been blown, her mouth grew wide and was suddenly filled with countless sharp teeth. She wanted to take my head off, but a quick shot from the crossbow stopped her. A bolt went through her cheek, shattering her teeth. She screamed, thrashing around, before the man shot her again. She ripped the bolt from her face and jumped backwards. Mia landed on all fours, snarling with a blood-filled mouth. To my horror, a ripping sound came as she sprouted massive bat wings. Her hands became claws, and her face transformed into something so far from human that I almost doubted she had once been the friend I cared for. In a flash, she launched herself into the treetops, joining the other white creatures that watched the scene at a distance. It took me a long time to realize the stranger started to drag me away. My brain was so numb from the shock, I didn't remember how long we walked on the trail, or what anyone said to me most of the way back. I knew the man was whistling again, and I snapped, wanting the noise to end. He stopped for a few minutes, then I realized the noise was the only thing keeping the creatures away. He playfully started back up again as Kenny and I kept our heads forward, trying to ignore the horrors in the trees. Darren was waiting for us at the end of the trail at the outside of the woods. A lone police officer stood next to him, face as cold as steel. We stopped in front of them, unsure of what to say or how to explain ourselves. "Did you take care of the problem?" the officer said, sounding annoyed. "Problems? And nope, too many of them to deal with, and get these three out at the same time. I'm going back in to see what I can do. Sure do wish I had a friend come along with me," the stranger said, with a loud and exasperated sigh. I found my mouth opening to offer to go back and save Mia, but the cop stopped me. He saw 3 scared kids who would die if they tried to fight some monsters in the dark woods. "None of that. This is your job. Now go do it while I take care of my duties." The man shrugged again and pulled something out of his pocket. I expected it to be a pack of cigarettes, but he opened a small jar of dried cinnamon sticks. He tried to offer one to Kenny, who refused. I reached out and took one, not to start chewing on it like he did, but I needed something real from that night or else my brain wouldn't believe it had happened. "This one's bit. Do you have anything for him?" the officer asked, and the stranger shook his head. Without warning, the cop pulled out a package of syringes with some sort of clear mystery fluid inside. Kenny didn't protest the shot. The officer then reached into his back pocket and pulled out 3 folded pieces of paper. "Sign these statements. The story is your friend got up in the middle of the night and got lost. We'll search for her tomorrow," the cop said and handed us a sheet of paper. Darren looked disgusted, but he signed his name. Kenny needed some prodding to do the same. I refused, and it made the officer glower in my direction. "What if I tell a different story?" I threatened, ready to face whatever retaliation might happen. "You can. I say it would be better for you mentally to get the story out, but no one will believe you. As it is, people will assume you did something to that girl. Don't make it harder on yourself," the stranger said, as he rolled the cinnamon stick between his teeth. I hated him. I hated myself, and I hated what had happened. I signed the paper, and the officer told us to get in the car so he could take us to the station. He made us repeat the same fake story a few dozen times. As we drove off, I looked out the back window to see the stranger giving us a sarcastic wave, and I saw the lights of the car being reflected by so many eyes watching in the trees. There was a search for Mia, but nothing turned up. People have whispered about what happened. None of it's even close to the truth. Kenny and Darren started to stay inside and away from accusing stares. I've heard they're not as close as they were before. I've started saving up as much as I can to move away. There's nothing left for me in this place except bad memories. I don't know if that man hunted down all the monsters lurking in the woods, and deep down, I hope he didn't kill the thing that Mia turned into. Twisted or not, I wanted a part of her to live on, no matter how selfish that was. I need to leave this place. I found myself wanting to go back to those woods and try to find her, and that desire scares me. The real Mia would want me to live, and that's what I'm going to try to do. I'm a little surprised that I'm writing this, since I was never that much into the supernatural. I say not that much because my older sister, Rita, was mesmerized by it. She was 6 years older than me. So most of what she did with her friends in the attic of our garage was a mystery. The garage attic was strictly off limits. They guarded it like an inner sanctum. It wasn't until my mother discovered the Ouija board that I began to understand that something was amiss. We weren't particularly religious, but we did attend church on holidays. My mother went on a tirade when my father got home from work, insisting that my sister was inviting evil spirits into our house. My dad threw out the Ouija board, and later, I picked it up out of the trash and used it for target practice with my brother's BB gun. None of that would have been particularly memorable, except the following night, my sister was babysitting me. Normally, as soon as my parents left, they would call Brenda down the street to come down and split the babysitting money with her and leave. I didn't complain since Brenda was much more interested in my stories than my sister and her friends, but tonight, my sister stayed home and invited her friend Angie over. They told me to stay in my parents' room as they disappeared into the basement. I grew up in the Midwest, and we had one of those old, deep basements. The house was over 100 years old, and the basement was a place that I can only remember visiting maybe once or twice when I dropped some toys into the heating vent, and my dad had to go into the basement and disconnect some ductwork. There were only 2 small windows that were barely large enough for a child to fit through, but way too small for an adult. I remember there was a cold draft, too. There was a brick wall that butted up to the stairs, leading down to the basement that had partially collapsed. I remember looking into that darkness and asking my dad where it led, and he said it led beneath the house. My parents never had to tell me not to go into the basement. I was petrified of it. I think I was playing with toy soldiers in my parents' room when I heard their blood-curdling screams. I don't remember being afraid, but they both came running up the basement stairs and ran straight past me out of the house, slamming the basement door behind them. I was 7 years old at the time. I had no idea why I didn't follow them. I just sat there on the floor with my toy soldiers. And then I heard the footsteps. I thought maybe it was one of my older brothers, Joey, who was down the street playing guitar with his friend Steven. They were always playing pranks. The door to the basement was locked. I could hear the door being pushed. The lock was just a wooden disc my dad had made. When they slammed the door, it had fallen down and locked. I heard it hit the floor when the door burst open. And that's about all I remember. I woke up the next day in the hospital. Later I was told that my sister had run down the street to get my brother, and they said they'd found me unconscious on the floor. The doctor said I'd had a convulsion. That's what I believed for 13 years, at least until last night. My sister Rita went on to become a flight attendant, and my brother Joey, I still call him that, became a DNR officer. We love each other dearly, but because I live on the other side of the country, we don't stay in touch as much as we used to. At least, we don't as often as when I was living in Michigan. I'd flown back from my father's funeral, and we were all reminiscing on my parents' porch. That's when my brother Joey brought up the night that I'd had the convulsion. "He made us swear to never tell you the truth," Joey said, taking a long drag off his cigarette. "But now that he's gone, I guess we can tell you what really happened." I looked over at Rita, thinking this might be a joke, but the look of dread on her face told me that whatever Joey was about to say was not for my amusement. "You sure this is a good idea?" she said nervously. Joey crushed his cigarette out on the wooden bench. "You didn't have a convulsion." Joey leaned in, the flicker of the porch light casting shadows across his face, making him look more solemn than usual. "What happened to you that night wasn't anything medical." There was a long, uncomfortable silence. For a moment, I thought he wasn't going to tell me what had happened. "When Rita and I got back to the house, we found something with you." Joey glanced at Rita, and as if on cue, she said, It wasn't human." My mind went to the rational explanation of a rabid dog or maybe a feral raccoon. They both laughed when I asked if it was an animal. "So what was it?" I said. "It was like a shadow, and it was floating above you," Rita said, her voice barely audible. I laughed and got up to go back inside. "I don't believe in ghosts," I said. "Wasn't no fucking ghost," Joey said, unbuttoning his shirt and showing me a scar on his chest. "You got that when you fell out of a tree," I replied. "I remember you telling me." "No, it's a story we made up. You did that to me," he said, tapping out another cigarette. Nothing in their demeanors suggested this was a prank, but perhaps I'd underestimated their acting skills. "I was 7 years old. There's no way It went inside you," Joey said. He looked over at Rita, who finished his sentence. "It possessed you. I know that sounds horrible, but it wasn't your fault." "This had better be a hidden camera prank," I said, looking around. "You picked me up in the air like I was a twig and threw me across the room. Then you started speaking in some crazy language," Joey said. "It was my fault," Rita said, her eyes full of tears. "Me and Angie asked the spirits to reveal themselves." None of this sparked any memories. How do you know you weren't imagining things? Joey laughed and looked down at his scar as he rebuttoned his shirt. I had trouble sleeping with you in my room for a year after that. You have any idea what it was like keeping that secret? A part of me wondered why they'd decided to break the news to me now. I looked over at Rita, hoping she would start laughing, but she was crying instead. Okay, so you two, what, saved me from an evil spirit? I asked sarcastically. Joey shook his head. Nah, Mom and Dad came home. My father was not a man prone to superstitions, so I was surprised when Joey decided to bring him into the story. And when he walked in, you started talking that crazy language, and then you started slinging Dad around the room like a wet noodle, he said, lighting a second cigarette. Joey laughed at the thought. I thought you were going to kill him, and that's when Mr. Payne walked in. I remembered Mr. Payne well. He always walked with a limp and was gardening in his backyard. We used to think it was funny that anyone had the last name Payne and that it would be perfect for a dentist, but he was a foreman at a factory. He heard the screams from across the street and came over to see what was wrong. Boy, did he ever get a surprise, Joey said. He was a good man, Rita said, wiping her eyes with a tissue. That thing started talking to him, and Mr. Payne started talking back in the same strange language. Joey was looking off in the distance. There's a lot you don't know about Mr. Payne. I couldn't help but think my siblings had watched The Exorcist one too many times. This is all unbelievable. I'm sorry. Did you know he studied to be a priest for 5 years and then gave it up when he met Mrs. Payne? Joey said, sitting on the porch rail. That's how he could speak to it. He studied those old languages. He started praying over you, and he asked Mom and Dad to get a priest, Rita added. I tried to envision Mr. Payne standing over me in prayer, but I couldn't hold the thought. All sounded so fantastical. There was a whole room full of them praying over you, all night long, Joey said. Every once in a while, we'd hear a ruckus, and Mr. Payne and it would start talking to each other again. So sorry, Rita said, reaching out to grab my hand. I've been wanting to tell you, God, for so long. It was strange, hearing a story about myself that sounded like a fairy tale. I knew the only way to find out if it was true was to ask Mr. Payne myself, but I wasn't even sure he was still alive. Is Mr. Payne still alive? I asked. Yeah, Joey said. He's over at the old folks' home. I saw him there when I went to Dad's birthday party a couple of years ago. I told my brother and sister that it was hard to believe, but if it did happen, I had no memory of it and forgave them for whatever it was worth. Seemed like it was important for them to hear that I forgave them, but it didn't sound like they'd done anything wrong. What I didn't tell them was that I planned to visit Mr. Payne tomorrow before my flight for California. I had a few hours in the morning, and given the circumstances, it seemed like the most rational thing to do. In retrospect, it was obviously not the wisest choice. That night, I sat in my hotel room trying to figure out why my siblings had come up with such a ridiculous story. They were both teenagers, and maybe they had misunderstood the situation. I might have lost my mind temporarily and then had a convulsion. Except the people praying over me all night long didn't seem to fit the story. But it was a small town with plenty of superstitious people. Wouldn't be the first time a group of well-meaning religious folks misdiagnosed a medical condition for a supernatural event. I woke up early the next morning and headed over to the nursing home. The last time I'd been to Hazelbuck Nursing Home was during my childhood. I would visit with my mom when my cousin was living there. My cousin had multiple sclerosis, and I remembered the place smelling bad, like Clorox. My cousin was always in good spirits and smiling, but I could never get over the smell of the place. To my surprise, the place had been completely renovated, and it even smelled better. There was a young lady in the front who greeted me. I asked if Mr. Payne was still a resident, and she asked me to sign in and pointed me towards room 144. I stood outside the room for a few moments. I still had time to turn around and head back to my normal, boring life in California. The radio was on, and I could hear Ernie Harwell doing a play-by-play announcement for the Tigers baseball game. Against my better judgment, I knocked on the door and heard a gruff voice say, "Door's open, come in." I walked in and saw Mr. Payne sitting in a recliner. He didn't look much different than I remembered him, but I could tell he was having trouble placing me. "It's Rich Thelen. You knew me as Richie," I said, smiling. Mr. Payne's demeanor changed immediately. It was as if he'd seen a ghost. I can come back another time if you..." No, it's fine. I just wasn't expecting to see anyone today." He pushed out a footrest. "Have a seat." I was suddenly uncomfortable. I guess I had half expected Mr. Payne to tell me it was just an overactive imagination, but judging from his reaction, I knew I wasn't going to like what he had to tell me. I thought about standing up and leaving. I'm sure he'd probably wonder why I showed up, but there was some doors that were just best to leave closed. This felt like one of those. "I heard about your dad. You just never know how long you got until the bell tolls." It took me a moment to reorient myself. I'd completely forgotten that I'd been at my dad's funeral yesterday. Yeah, he always said he'd probably die of a heart attack. My grandpa was 45 when he died the same way. "You mean Bill? I knew your grandpa. We used to hunt pheasant together." I didn't remember my grandpa. He died before I was born, so I didn't have anything to add. "I'm really surprised to see you," Mr. Payne said, slapping me on the knee. "You look good." "Thank you," I said, realizing I could just make small talk and leave. I didn't need to open any locked doors. I could just shoot the breeze. "So what brings you here?" Mr. Payne asked. "I came because I heard a crazy story, and I wanted to see if it was true." Mr. Payne ran his fingers through what was left of his gray hair. "I figured that's why you were here." Mr. Payne looked over his shoulder. "Can you get me some water? There's a cup next to the sink." I didn't know if that was a stall tactic or if he was preparing to give me a long speech, but I was happy to stand up and create some space between us. A few minutes later, I turned around with his water, and that's when I noticed he was holding a rosary. I handed him the water, and rather than sit back down, I took a couple of steps and leaned against the counter. "I've tried to forget that night," Mr. Payne said, sipping from the styrofoam cup. "You sure this wasn't just an overactive imagination?" I asked. The old man lifted an eyebrow. "Did they tell you what happened?" "What they could remember, yeah." Mr. Payne took a few more sips of water and thought for a long time. "Well, they were just kids, so they probably didn't tell you everything." I waited for him to say something, but he just sat there in silence. I don't think he really wanted to discuss it. "Mr. Payne, my brother said you dropped out of the priesthood." "I did. Mrs. Payne was a nun back then, and I was going to be a priest, but nature decided otherwise." I laughed, even though it wasn't funny. Again, I contemplated abruptly walking out of the room. "What you had in you was an old spirit, very old. It had come across the ocean from the old world, Europe. The language it spoke was Latin." None of this made any sense. Our house was old by the standards of the United States, but there was nothing ancient about it by European standards. "Why would an old spirit live in our basement?" I asked. Mr. Payne laughed. "Is that what they told you, that it was in your basement?" I nodded, surprised that there appeared to be a disagreement in their memories. Part of me hoped that the version I was about to hear was tethered in reality. "It visited your basement because your sister and her friends called out to it," Mr. Payne said, his hand holding the rosary as it started to shake. I thought back to my brother telling me there was a lot of things I didn't know about Mr. Payne. That was suddenly starting to sound like an understatement. Then where did it come from?" I asked. Mr. Payne's gaze went blank, and he started to mumble in a foreign language. That's when his eyes rolled back in his head, and a smile crossed his face. The following words rolled out of his mouth in a thick Italian accent. "Venit ex me." A moment later, his whole body began to shake. I pushed the nurse button next to the bed, still grounded in reality. I thought he was having a stroke. He was talking much clearer now, and I tried to remember it. Sponsium cum santa fide. And then I saw it with my own eyes. Black smoke, like tentacles, lifted out of his body and started taking the shape of a human. I was no longer in the nursing home. I was a petrified 7-year-old boy on the floor holding a toy soldier. Everything I had repressed came back in a terrifying moment. The cries, the prayers, and eventually being freed. With the last of his strength, Mr. Payne whispered, "Serveti ipsum, serveti ipsum," and a moment later the shadows enveloped him and vanished. A caregiver eventually arrived a few minutes later. They said he was having one of his episodes and asked if I'd come back another day. I walked out of the nursing home and realized I'd reopened a door that Mr. Payne had locked with great difficulty and sacrificed 30 years ago. I didn't know the specifics of what Mr. Payne had done that night or what had happened in Rome that caused Mr. Payne to leave the priesthood, but something told me it was more than simply meeting his wife. A few months later, I looked up the meaning of those words. Mr. Payne was telling me he'd made a pact with the darkness, and then he told me to save myself. I pray every day to be spared the fate that Mr. Payne had. I also pray for his soul to be released. And perhaps, most importantly, I make sure I keep the basement door well locked.